allows you, it doesn't allow me to save the video to my phone. Before I would save it to my phone and then upload that same video, but now I've got to record it for myself so that I can put it on YouTube for people. So anyway, sorry about that, but I just ignore it. It just sits there. Yeah. So it's so funny. I'm really curious what this winter season is going to be like, because I've been having about 4 to 5 people at the 8 o'clock time, and now lately it's gone up to 7 and 8 people at the 8 o'clock time. Mostly it's people who are teaching Sunday school or in other things, except for like one of the people, he likes to go to Robert's Bible study too. So he comes to mine, goes to church, and then goes to Robert's Bible study. So I'm very curious this winter season how that's going to play out. If you know, so I'm just going to keep going, and we'll just see what happens with it. So we are in Genesis chapter 20. We started from the first of Genesis, and we've been going through, and every week there's been something new that I didn't know, which I know that seems, of course, you don't know the whole Bible, but I've been a Christian a long time. I've heard a lot of sermons. I mean, I do know a little bit. And I'm so surprised at the things, that every single week there'd be something I had no idea about. So now I'm wondering, okay, well, what am I missing this time through? Because this is the second time that we started at Genesis and went all the way through. So who knows? I'll miss.
That's why you have to keep coming, I guess.
Or do I just forget it, and so I have to relearn it every...
The Holy Spirit just reveals more to us each time we read it, because there's a depth that just we'll never get to the end of it.
I think that's really true. And I think also at different times in our life, different things stick out to us. And
As you mature as a Christian, I read Pride and Prejudice when I was in 5th grade. And I've read it like every year since. And believe me, I missed a lot in the 5th grade. But
That's
I think
true.
Maybe that's it. As you mature as a Christian, you get more out of it.
that's really true. You recognize the connection. So just as a reminder then of where we were last week, because what happens, the events of this chapter are, we're picking out a piece in time, but this is all one long story. So we're going through it and really we're going to be looking at 2 chapters today. But where were we last week? What did we talk about last week? So I want you to remember that when we, last week in chapter 19, that Lot and his daughters are in Zoar. And if you remember, I'm not going to pull up the other map because it's not worth the thing, but over here is Sodom and Gomorrah, and Zoar was a little town. It means small. It's a small town outside of Sodom and Gomorrah is where Lot was. Remember that Abraham was here near Hebron in Mamre, that we saw the tree of Mamre. Last week I showed you a picture of that tree of Mamre, which was right here, and he could see what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah, not in detail, but like you would see Las Vegas from the hills surrounding Las Vegas. If you were in those hills and Las Vegas was destroyed, you would see it, right? You would see that destruction. So that's the kind of distance we're talking about here. This particular map, Abraham's going to be going to Gerar eventually. Notice where Gerar is. Notice that it's near the Negev. So the reason that it's important to know where we are in time, in the space, because we'll see the motivations for that. So if you remember, Abraham was visited by 2 angels and God himself, which was shocking to me because it uses the term Lord, and I don't really pay attention to the term Lord, except that when the term Lord in the translation is all caps, that means it's the name of God. And I actually went back to literal word and looked at the text, and it was Jehovah, Yahweh Jehovah, for the name of God was used, and that's why that's capital L-O-R-D. In most translations, that's what they'll do. So when you read your Bible that way, the way I used to read it, maybe it's my child version of the story, these 3 angels came to Abraham and told him la-di-da-di-da, and then those angels went to Lot. That's how I remember the story. But that's not the way it happened. If you remember, 2 angels and God himself came and to Abraham. And the 2 angels went on to Sodom and Gomorrah, and God stayed and had a little visit with Sarah and Abraham. Remember that? That was that part of that last chapter. So So they're over here in Hebron, just north of Hebron and Mamre. Well, not really north, kind of northeast, kind of this way. So they could see everything that happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. And now we're going to remember that at that time that God, Abraham bartered down with God that if there were even 5 people left in Sodom and Gomorrah that were righteous, that God would save it. So were there 5? There was Lot, his wife, the 2 daughters. Remember, the 2 sons-in-law wouldn't come. That would have been 6. That would have saved the city. But there were only 4 that were considered godly or righteous. And so God destroyed Sodom, but he allowed those 4 to escape. And so that was what we ended with. So I have some verses I need some people to look up. I would like someone to look up Luke 17, 26 to 28. Does somebody want to take that? Luke 17. Who would like to read that one?
I'll do that.
Okay. And I need someone to read Matthew 24, 36 to 42. Want to do that one? Okay. And I need someone to read Hebrews 13, 1 and 2. Do you mind taking Hebrews, Judy? Okay. Hebrews 13, verses 1 and 2. Okay, so while you're looking those up, I just generally reviewed that story, okay? Just generally what happened. So now we're going to look at what does Jesus say, what is the importance of that story that we read according to Jesus. So Eve, if you would read it, everyone listen to Luke 17, 26 through 28.
Just as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. People went on eating, drinking, marrying, giving in marriage until the day Noah boarded the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. It will be the same as it was in the days of Lot. People went on eating, drinking, buying, selling, planting, and building.
Okay, so that's what Jesus says that we should have the takeaway be from those stories that we read. Matthew 24, 36 to 42.
But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. Then there will be 2 men in the field, one will be taken and one will be left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one will be left. Therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming.
So that those 2 passages are both Christ talking. Matthew and Luke recorded it. So in other words, this issue of the application of the story of Lot and Sodom and Gomorrah and the story of Noah are considered to be similar stories with similar patterns, and they apply to us and really us, because we are really, the clock is really ticking down. And we're getting truly down to those very end times. There's not much left to fall into place before the next things start to cascade. So the point is that, not the point is, but so let's say in our words, what does it mean for us? The stories of Lot and the stories of Noah are lessons for us right now. In what way? How should my mind be thinking? Don't answer. Hebrews 13, 1 and 2. Judy?
Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by doing so, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it.
What was the very first verse?
Keep on loving one another, like brothers and sisters.
We keep loving one another. We keep doing what is right. We keep doing what we know to do. And maybe God will come and visit us. It might be three people, two of them might be angels, but the one will be God, right? There's that, right? There's the thing that we're to do. Living every day as if it could be the last moment or the last day. This is not the time to put off anything. On the other hand, God has his timing. And we need to respect that God knows how to reach people. I was just talking to someone this morning about a person that I'm concerned about. And I'm just concerned because they're choosing sin over godliness. And they are a Christian. They know God. But they're choosing certain sinful behaviors over their walk with God. So we were talking about what do we do? We tried, do we text? Do we call? How do we've had, so how do we, it's a tricky thing because God has to work with his spirit in that person's life. So at one point we have to feel an urgency to talk with people and to bring them to Christ. On the other hand, we have to respect that God has his timing and people are going to have a choice. When God sent the two angels to go on ahead to Sodom, was there a choice? Lot said, look, don't do this. How about this? How about that? Lot tried to reason with them, right? But they would not be reasoned with. They would not be reasoned with. The angels had to pull them back in the door and say, come on, we've got to get your family and go. Right? That God is offering opportunities all along. So what's our mentality supposed to be? How are we supposed to behave? You can't force someone to love God. Reasoning with them takes time. And sometimes the time is running out. So what God is telling us, Jesus is telling us in Luke and Matthew, is to have don't just lay back. Don't just sit back and do nothing. Step up. Do what needs to be done. Offer, try, work towards people. There's that effort that we make. And we need to consider the time is short. Don't lay back and say, I'll talk to him next week. You get a prompting. You get an idea. You think, I think I should call so-and-so and just see if I can encourage him to come to church with me on Sunday. But you don't do it because you're watching a good show on TV. Or you just started a video on your phone. I'll do that later. And then you never do it, right? Those are the promptings. Those are the things we got to say, wait a minute. I'm going to do that right now. Who knows if in the next moment I'll be caught up to be with Jesus and I'll be gone. And most people would say me saying a statement like that is foolish. Most people, if you said to your average Joe Blow Christian at your park or your neighborhood and you said, yeah, we need to really get on that right now because you never know if we'll have another day. They would go, oh, it's one of those.
Yes, yeah.
One of those weirdos.
I would listen.
You would listen?
Yeah, because I've come there.
Yeah.
I think when you come close to dying, I think it just changes your whole perspective on life. And your gratitude, your appreciation, and you might not get tomorrow. So what are you going to do today?
And before you know that you have something that could kill you, you already have it. Isn't that right? I could have a heart condition right now that I don't know about, and that heart condition could be what I die of in 5 minutes. Even if you don't believe that the second coming is going to happen or we'll be raptured or whatever, let's say there's something like that you're off on. Just that mortality is a truth that we all know, or we should all know.
You know what? A meteor could fall from the sky and kill us all right now. Right now. I tell people I'll pray for you, and I used to say I'll pray for you, and I keep calling that later. And now I hang up the phone and I stop right that second.
Good. That's a
because
very good point.
I forget, and then later I feel so guilty because I think I said I could do that. And
That's a
I
good
know for
point.
myself how important that was. I really think you all saved my life.
Yes.
And so now it's like, no, I can't do it 5 minutes from now. I have to stop right this second.
God saved your life, and thankfully we were able to make that case, for that. We made that case and we prayed, and God was willing to do that. So thank God. But eventually you're going to die, Judy.
Oh,
I will pray for you again. But-
absolutely.
but at some
I
point-
had that conversation with my grandkids. It's like, and it's okay.
Yeah, well, Lazarus did die. I mean, you don't see Lazarus walking around. He was raised from the dead, but he's not walking around now. It happens. But there were two people that did not, Elijah and Enoch. Was it Enoch and Elijah or Shah? One of the Eli's. Yeah, yeah. Did you want to make a comment?
I forgot.
I'm so sorry.
No problem. That happens.
Okay, so my point is that we need to, when we read the scripture, we need to not only read what we read and understand and talk together and reflect, but we also need to make sure we pay attention to what the scripture says about itself. In that story of Sodom and Gomorrah, there's all kinds of lessons out of that. The story of Noah, there's all kinds of lessons out of that. But the one that Jesus chose was to tell us and to make a point about was that idea that we do not know the time or the day and that we need to be ready. Yes, Eve?
And to go along with that, and what Mark, a little bit of what Mark was saying about fellowship. So it's like in your class, we were talking about Lot's wife and looking back. And I want you to know that on Tuesday afternoon in my study group, we ended up talking about that very same thing. Laura reminded us, don't look back. God's going to take care of everybody else. When you know it's time to go, you need to go. Don't go get whatever you think it is you need to go get. And so one of the gals said, but my husband,
Right.
That's a hard thing to.
That is absolutely right.
Yeah, it really is. You're so used to go get the things that are important to me. Sure.
But on the other hand, what that does is it changes our thinking. Because when you think about, I'm not going to be able to take my husband with me. He's not going, and I can't take him with me. No amount of turning around and grabbing a hold of him is going to take him with me. I better get on that. Right? It again goes back to the urgency of doing what we can to bring people to a saving knowledge. Maybe there's nothing that you can do that would convince that husband, but it then brings it back to the urgency of it. Because we got to recognize that everything here we need to be able to let go of. And if there's anything we can't let go of, we have to say why. Do I not believe that God is powerful enough to take care of my dogs if they don't get to go with us, right? Or is there anything that I can say or do that would bring my husband to a saving knowledge? Is there anything I can do to bring my son to a saving knowledge? Is my son once saved, always saved because he had a sincere faith as a young child? Is that going to work? When you really think about the people that you love and care about, it begins to feel urgent, which is the whole point. If you feel an urgency, because God feels an urgency, He set the clock at the beginning of time. If you'd like to learn more about that, Jimmy Evans does a really good job about talking about the time and setting the time for any end time events in the tipping point. And God set the time in the very beginning of when this is going to end. So it's not like He's just going along and we'll just wait a little bit longer, wait a little longer. The time is ticking away, and we are getting very close to that time when it's going to be the mark. And then the thing I pray for is that if this person that I'm concerned about is not have a saving knowledge of Christ, then I am so thankful for that 7 years of tribulation. Even though I feel terrible that people that are left are going to be martyred, at least they have a chance. And I know that there's a lot of people, when the scripture talks about the believers that are killed for their faith because they don't take the mark of the beast, I think there are a lot of people today that I could see would be in that time, and at least they would have the chance. They know enough about what we believe in the Bible and what we believe as Christians that when we're gone, that's going to be real for them. It's going to be real for them.
They'll understand what happened.
They'll get out there. They'll dust off that Bible you sent them all those years ago, and they'll dust off those letters or those things that that they had from us back then. They'll be looking at the same videos we're learning from now and saying, oh no, and then 7 years and this 3.5, and oh my, they're going to be seeing all of that take place. So hopefully that's the chance for them, right? So I have even started writing notes to the one that I'm concerned about, because I figure they'll have to come and see if they can get our property, maybe get into our safe and get whatever we need, about that kind of stuff. Because we told them, all of our kids know what to do if we're gone. And I'm thinking, okay, I better leave a lot of notes in case we're raptured and he comes here looking for whatever resources we have to get this letter. Right? That's the way we need to think. We need to think in terms of whatever it is, there's no waiting. We've got to take care of it. Whatever it is, we need to do it now, because tomorrow we may or may not have tomorrow. We may not have the next 5 minutes. And like Judy said, that's true no matter what, even if you don't believe anything about the second coming. Just we don't control our lives.
You know, I was thinking as you were talking about leaving those notes, that's such a good idea, because, we've heard a little bit from other, public ministry type people that have said that, you know, when the rapture happens, the world is gonna look for an explanation, and, one that appears to be kind of one they're gonna go to will be aliens,
Oh yeah.
alien abduction.
Oh yeah. There'll
And
be
so
all kinds of stuff.
If you take that step to write the truth in and down, and maybe, you know, you've told them over and over again, but to have it down, and then it's fresh on their minds, and they read that, and they have something to counteract what is being told by the media.
They're going to see those people that I'm talking about, the ones who were brought up as children in a church and, you know, that they just went their own way, those kind of children. Those people know who are real Christians, and they're going to see who's gone. You know what I mean? So they're going to, I know for this individual I'm talking about, they're going to look around and they're going to see almost every single member of their immediate family just gone. They're going to know. From all over the place. We don't all live in the same place, but we share faith. And it's unusual. The few that don't have an active working faith is unusual in our family group. Even cousins to cousins' kids, like that far out. So I know that there's going to be some like that, where they're going to see the consistency of who's gone, and they'll know no matter what the world says. And those people, I think, would readily die for their faith then, at that point. Whatever doubts they have that it's kind of a silly, weird way to think about things, I think that's going to be their one last chance, you know.
Yeah.
But the problem is it's going to be hard for them. It'll be hard for everyone anyway, but it'll be especially hard for them because of the whole mark of the beast stuff. And that'll be the hard part. So I figure when we pass, we have a whole, I've written our kids, I tell them where everything's at to get a hold of this attorney and do this and that and whatever, so things are in order for us. And so I'm just adding special notes. Now, if you happen to notice that so-and-so, that they're all gone, and you're here, please read this note carefully. You're about to lose your head, but at least you'll win your soul. Anyway, we're in Genesis chapter 20, and today, the very first chapter, sorry, Carolyn, if this is getting all long. Poor Carolyn, she's the one who listens later. Okay, in Genesis chapter 20, we're going to read the very first sentence. Now, Abraham moved on from there into the region of Negev and lived between Kadesh and Shur. For a while he stayed in Gerar, and there Abraham said of his wife Sarah, "She is my sister." Then Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent for Sarah and took her. So where we are is here. So he was up here by the Mamre tree, just near Hebron. Can you see, Carolyn? It's probably backwards too. Anyway. So he was like up here, and he saw what happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. And then where does he go? That away. Yeah. Wouldn't you? Yeah. He saw what happened down here. He heads out. Now he's still on the edge of the Negev. The Negev desert is this whole region, and he's still right in this area. Abraham seems to really prefer the desert. He keeps staying in that desert region. And so he's in Gerar, but then he kind of comes out of Gerar. And by the way, does anybody remember this area? Who ends up living in that area in the long run? Starts with a PH? Yes! Oh, good for you. So this is the area of the Philistines. This ends up being where the Philistines are. Later in later Bible times, we read about the different people groups. That's where the Philistines end up being. So this king Abimelech won, because there's going to be another Abimelech later on. And this now is the second sister for wife story. Abraham, you should have learned your lesson. What is he thinking? Anyway, what's bad is there's a third one. The first one was Abraham with Pharaoh, and that was in in the Pharaoh of Egypt. That was in chapter 12. And Abraham and Sarah traveled to Egypt because of a famine. And then God dealt harshly with the Pharaoh. Remember, he spoke to him indirectly through a plague of sudden impotence. Now, in the Bible, sometimes it talks about sexual issues. It generally talks about it being a female problem. You know, that the woman was barren or whatever. But in the story of Pharaoh, it was the men who couldn't do business. And guess what? The same thing happens to Abimelech's land. Suddenly they couldn't do the deed. So it was a problem. And we're going to read about that in just a moment. But there's a third time. Guess who the third one is? Isaac with his wife Rachel. He goes into Abimelech too. The son of Abimelech and the son of Abraham have the same kind of situation. And he's trying to pass Rebecca off as his sister. And they go there because of famine. We'll read about it later on in chapter 26. But I just want to make the point that this is a set of three. We're in the second set, the second time that we have record of Abraham doing it. But according to Abraham's own words, it appears like it was a way that he kind of got through the land, kind of a thing that he would do. But do you remember when the angels were, not the angels, but when the three came to Abraham and Sarah, do you remember that other angels went on ahead to Sodom and Gomorrah, the two angels, and then what did God tell Sarah? He said, you're going to have a baby in 1 year. In 1 year, you will have the child of promise. So they're there. Sodom and Gomorrah thing happened. They move over to Gerar. We're getting close. I mean, it would be in 1 year. So she's got to get pregnant within the next 3 months, right? So God is going, Abraham, what are you doing? You're messing it up again. Because God's got this plan to solve sin. And there's a certain time to it. Now, Abraham and Sarah are ticking time like this. How old is Sarah? 90? 89? She's 89, and Abraham's 99. By the time they give birth to the child, she's 99. I mean, she's 90, and he's 100. So, there are no young chicks.
No.
Now, there is Ishmael. How old is Ishmael? Ishmael's about 14 at the time the promise comes. So Ishmael's been around for a while. Now, if you had one son, now it was by the other woman that your wife doesn't like too much, but she told you to have him, so you've got Ishmael. Do you love that son? That's the one you got. That's the one you're loving. That's the one you're spending time with. That's the one Abraham is raising. That's an important part in the story. Okay, so we have these three things. God says it's not a big deal. It's a half-truth. But to God, it's a big deal because it's putting the whole plan of salvation at risk. Okay, so let's see. Verse 3. But God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, you are as good as dead because of the woman you have taken. She is a married woman. Now Abimelech had not gone near her. So he said, Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Did he not say to me, she is my sister? And didn't she also say he is my brother? I have done this with a clear conscience and clean hands. Then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept you from sinning against me. Do you wonder how he did that? Look down to verse 17. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his slave girls, so they could have children again, for the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham's wife Sarah. Now, they were not there for very long. They were only there for a few months. The most could have been 3 months, because she does get pregnant with Isaac later. So, and Isaac gets born within that 1 year. So we're talking about within 2 or 3 months. The polite way to say is that God closed up the womb. But what he did is the same thing he did in the first case. They couldn't get it up. They couldn't do the deed. That's what happened here. That's also what happened in the first incident. It's trying to politely say that. But you wouldn't have known that no one was getting pregnant in a month, even in 2 months. You wouldn't know no one was. There wouldn't be a big problem in that much time. But the fact that the men couldn't consummate it, that you would notice. But how else is God going to protect the promise that's to come? How else does he protect it? Goofy Abraham.
I wonder why he didn't do that when Ishmael was conceived.
Because
that wasn't the promise either.
right. But Ishmael does have a promise linked with him. He's going to be a father of many nations. He ends up being the genes of the Arab people. And he had 12 sons. And so there's a whole thing that went on with him, but it's not this promise of salvation. It's not the lineage to Christ that God was creating. He was creating that through Abraham and Sarah.
It sure would have saved them a whole lot of problems throughout history, though, if that hadn't happened.
I'm so glad. I don't know all the things that God knows, but I'm sure there's a very particular reason. You know, why does he bring it down through this generation and not that generation? Why did he use this dummy Abraham? Wasn't there anybody better than Abraham around? Because it seems like he doesn't really make all that great of decisions. I mean, for somebody that's supposed to be this great patriarch, give me a break.
And he's in the Hall of Faith.
Except that it sure does make me feel better about my Christian walk and my failings and my things that I repeat and I have difficulty with. It makes me feel like God could even use me. And he can use you, even though you're just as much a ninny as I am, and we're all just as much a ninny as Abraham, right? God doesn't need perfect people. He just needs people willing to do what he asks for them to do. Let's go on. Verse 6, then God said to him in the dream, yes, I know you did this with a clear conscience, and so I have kept. In other words, God's protection was on him by making it so that they couldn't even have anything go on. You from sinning against me, this is why I did not let you touch her. See, God is preventing him from touching her. Now return the man's wife, for he is a prophet. Boom, 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 boom. First time the word prophet used. What is a prophet? Priest. A priest is one who takes what people and talks to God. The prophet takes what God says and talks to the people. Has Abraham done anything that would tell us he's a prophet? He's done a few good things along the way, but I don't see anything prophetic. I don't see anything where he's telling. So how is it that Abraham is God's prophet? Because through him, the promise is on him. And it's through his line that God is going to make Christ come through. God is going to deal with this problem of sin through this line. And this is the path toward Christ. So God is making sure that Abraham doesn't mess it up along the way. And and he will pray for you and you will live. But if you do not return her, you may be sure that you and all of yours will die. Early the next morning, Abimelech summoned all his officials, and when he told them all that had happened, they were very much afraid. Then Abimelech called Abraham in and said, what have you done to us? How have I wronged you that you have brought such great guilt upon me and my kingdom? You have done things to me that should not be done. And Abimelech asked Abraham, what was your reason for doing this? Okay, now listen to Abraham's answer. This irritated me. I wanted to slap him. Abraham replied, I said to myself, there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God had me wander from my father's household, I said to her, this is how you can show your love to me. Everywhere we go, say of me, he is my brother. Does that sound like a good...
Sounds a little weaselly.
Yeah, if I was God, I would have just slapped him. Verse 14. Then, go ahead.
We have to think about Sarah was mentioned in 1 Peter as obeying. It took a lot of faith on Sarah's part to just obey.
Yes, and Abraham is also one of those listed as faith, full of faith, as an hero of faith. So yes, and I keep pointing out their faults because I feel like sometimes we make it sound like they were perfect and we need to be perfect like them. But actually what we need to do is be perfect like them. He wasn't perfect because he did everything exactly right. He was perfect because he was willing to do what God told him to do. He obeyed God, and that was counted to righteousness for him. And that's true for us, that our obedience to God is what's important. Not that we do everything perfect all the time, but our willingness to obey and to do what he said. And then we need to not do stupid stuff like this, right? This was silly for him to do that. But of course, we all know what it's like to do silly stuff that we shouldn't do. Gets us into problems. God works his plan.
You're
Yes.
right, though, that this does imply that he was doing this everywhere that because it
Yeah.
says that everywhere we go.
Yes. Yeah, like that was his way of doing things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Verse 14. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle. Oh, the other thing, I'm sorry. You know, Sarah is 89, 90 years old. So she must have been a looker, right? Even if you want to say that Abraham's going to live to be 175, so maybe it's like to us, if we were going to live to be 100 at 50 years old. Well, I'm 61. I can't imagine having a baby. I can't imagine that. So, verse 14. Then Abimelech brought sheep and cattle, male and female slaves, and gave them to Abraham, and he returned Sarah his wife to him. And Abimelech said, "My land is before you, live wherever you like." To Sarah he said, "I am giving your brother 1,000," in other words, he was his brother. Did you catch that? Yeah. "I'm giving your brother 1,000 shekels of silver. This is to cover the offenses against you before all who are with you. You are completely vindicated." Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech his wife and his slave girls so they could have children again. For the Lord had closed up every womb in Abimelech's household because of Abraham, Sarah's wife. I want to make sure I got all of this. Okay, remember last week we talked about the hospitality culture of that area? Another part of the culture that we don't understand as well is that honor and shame are more important than right and wrong. That's the way that they thought about things. So Abimelech is giving him these gifts because he wants to be the honorable man, not the shame one. Hi, Jim. We had 8 this morning. So on the terms of honor and shame, that's the paradigm that they function on that we don't understand as well in our current
It's actually
culture.
rewarding him for tricking him
Right.
and getting,
And we're like into right and wrong. He did wrong, so he should be punished. But what Abimelech, who has no association with God, Abimelech, he's just a guy, a king, a pagan king. He is trying to right this wrong in terms of shame and honor. So by giving them this, it's like it brings honor to them, and so then it brings honor to him, to Abimelech also. It was kind of their way of thinking of these kinds of situations. Okay. Chapter 21. Are you thinking things are going to get better? I hope not. Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age. What about her old age? At the very time God had promised him. So this has been a year since they left that area that they were at, the Mamre tree. Abraham gave the name Isaac to the son Sarah bore him. By the way, Isaac means laugh. Where's it at? It means laughter, one who laughs. So to the son Sarah bore him. When his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Now remember when we talked about circumcision? We talked about how the Egyptians practiced circumcision. I showed you a picture of a statue that showed an Egyptian male who had been circumcised. It was clearly evident, still a stone. And that was 1,000 years before this. That was an Egyptian practice. But God told Abraham to circumcise as a part of his sign of the covenant. But it was not a foreign idea to them. It wasn't something they'd never heard of or seen. They had been down in Egypt. He had been in Egypt for a while, so he'd seen that before. It wasn't like something brand new. It was brand new to him, and God told him to make that the sign of the covenant. So he did circumcise his son, Isaac. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in my old age. So in this section, Abraham laughed in chapter 17, 15 to 17, when God told him about Isaac coming. Sarah laughed in chapter 18, 10 to 12, when the angels and God, said the promise will happen in 1 year. Now she's 90 years old, and Isaac is born, and his name means he who laughs. And that's that connection there. The child grew and was weaned. On the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a feast. This was common. Think about in that time, for example, we don't hear about Sarah being joyful of the child until the child is circumcised and 8 days old. Why? Why don't we hear that the child was born and she was ecstatic? Because a lot of babies died. A lot of very young children died. A lot of them didn't transition from being an infant to being a toddler to being a kid. That was, the younger you were, the more likely it was that something bad was going to happen. So when a child came to the age of weaning, which means they can feed themselves, they can chew food, they can walk around, they don't have to just suckle. When they come to that point, that's a huge thing. And so they would the whole family would gather and have a big feast to celebrate that the child was weaned. So how old is Ishmael? He was 14 back when the promise was given. So if Isaac was weaned somewhere between the ages of 2 and 4, somewhere in there, then Ishmael's probably 16 to 18, maybe in that age.
He had the pregnancy time.
Well, that was before. So if you count all that time, Isaac is about between 2 and 4, and Ishmael's between 14 and 16, maybe, 16 to 18 if it was 2, so 16 to 18. Okay, that's important to know when we read this next part. Are all of you parents of kids? Have anybody not have any kids? You haven't had kids? Okay. Listen to those of us who've had kids. Tell me if this doesn't sound like any 17-year-olds you've known. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne, notice she doesn't say her name, that woman, to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. Now, have you ever heard of a 17-year-old who might mock the 2-year-old little prince, the chosen one, who wasn't around for 14 years? He was the oldest one, this first son of this great Abraham. Now we have Isaac come along. However, the consequences seem pretty harsh for a 17-year-old who was just mocking. So let's take a look at this again. Verse 11. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. Which one? I think Ishmael. Could have been Isaac. Either way, he's very concerned. Whichever son. I think Ishmael too. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your maidservant. So that would indicate Ishmael. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation, also because he is your offspring. Early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent them off with the boy. Look at where he's sending them off, out into the middle of the desert, into the Negev. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba, down in this area. When the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. We read that, we go, put the boy. He's 17 years old. In other words, she said, you stay under this bush. I'm going to go over here. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away. Remember that at distances was by a bow shot. That's going to have application later. For she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, And the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation." Do you hear that? Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. How far was she from him? A bow shot away. So he became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So they're living out here in the desert of Paran, and Egypt is very close by, and she's from Egypt, so she finds a good wife for him out of Egypt.
This makes it sound like Ishmael is much younger.
It does, doesn't it?
Oh, it makes him sound like he's just a little kid, like 5 or 6 years old, and she's leading by the hand and he's crying and.
Uh-huh. That's the way we kind of hear it too, when we, in our understanding, because when we read a chapter, but that might be 10 years later or 2 months. You know, the time. It's hard to measure the time when you're reading like this a story. Yes, it does make it sound that way. Now let's talk about the mocking. That word mocking that's used. I'm going to say this slow so that Carolyn has time to write down these verses, because I know she's going to want to look them up. Okay, so Carolyn's the one who listens on YouTube. So, okay, so there are 12 places that the word it is used. The word, it's a verb, and if you were going to put it into English, it'd be S-A-E-Q, psych, something like that. When I was reading it, going psych, like a kid teases, goes psych, I psyched you out, you know, that kind of thing. But that's not the word. It's S-A-E-Q. If we were going to write it in English, it's a verb. It can mean multiple things. I'm going to give you 12 places it's translated. Laughed. It's translated as laughed in Genesis 17:17, 18:12, 13, and 15. So in Genesis 17:17, in Genesis 18:12, 13, 15. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4 times. That's used to be laughed and translated as laughed. When you read the context, you can see why they use the term laughed. In Genesis 19:14, it's translated as jesting, J-E-S-T, jesting, like make a jest or a joke. In Genesis 21:6, that's what we just read, it's translated as laugh. So there's only one place that it's actually translated as laugh. Well, it's also translated laugh in, it's past tense in the other one. This one is just plain laugh. And then in Genesis 21:9, that's this verse we just read, it's translated as mocking. Back up in 21:6, when it says translated as laugh, that's what Sarah did. When it says that Sarah laughed, that's the same word. So isn't it funny that we use the same word to describe Sarah laugh and then describe this horrible offense of Ishmael that sent him out to his death almost? So it's the same word. The Genesis 26:8, now things take a little turn here. Remember I told you that there were 3 times that that this happened with trying to pass the wife off? And the third time was Isaac with his wife Rebecca. He tells Abimelech. He tells Abimelech the second, so the son of the Abimelech that Abraham dealt with, that Rebecca is his sister. That's what he tells him. And then someone sees Isaac caressing, fondling, and knows that Rebecca's his wife. So whatever he was doing made it clear that Rebecca was his wife. So that doesn't really fit with mocking or laughing or jesting. Something physical was happening that made them know that that was husband-wife, not not something else, not a sister. And so that is in Genesis 26:8. The scripture actually is translated caressing in that space. In Genesis 39:14 and 17, the word is used to make sport. And the connotation of that is that they were trying to like lie with me, making sport to lie with me, like wanting to seduce or something. There's something sexual involved in that also. And that's in Genesis 39:14 and 17. In Exodus 32:6, the word is translated play. But it's described play, P-L-A-Y. But it's describing the children of Israel when Moses came down from the mountain. It has like a sexual innuendo. They were dancing around, drinking, and playing. So it has like this sexual intonation. It wouldn't really be our word for play. And then in Judges 16:25, it's translated as entertained. And that's when Samson is brought to the stadium, and he's the entertainment of the crowd, seeing him tied up to the pillars. He was the entertainment. So, considering the ages of the kids, some would say that mocking was more of a sexual thing, a problem. I don't know that I agree with that. What I think is that, my opinion is that if you have the child of promise and he's 2 and just beginning to come into his own, and you have the 17-year-old who was the oldest son, the one that had been the closest to the father and all that, how do you allow the young one to grow up to be the leader? And if the older one is going to be mocking, teasing, oh, you think you're the child, like that, how's that going to work? I personally think that was more of the case, the problem for Abraham. And it says here that Abraham was not happy about any of it. It doesn't say that he was on Sarah's side. He didn't want any of it. But God told him to do what Sarah says. All it says here is that Abraham was disturbed about it. He was upset about the whole thing. But God told him, do what Sarah says. So you'll have to make up your own mind because it's unclear. Notice that Sarah didn't even speak their names. So the water and the bread she's carrying out, she wanders aimlessly in the Negev. He's been in the household for 17 years and he's evicted with bread and water. Ishmael was heartbroken. He was Abraham's only son for years, and now he is cast out. And who knows whether it was something like of a sexual teasing or if it was just, well, you think you're all that. I was here first. We don't know. It seems like the punishment was too cruel and right to be approved by God if it was just teasing. It seems like it had to be more than just kids teasing. It had to be more than that. So whatever it is, I'm not sure. In Genesis chapter 17, at verse 17, it says that God heard the boy crying. So he heard the brokenness of the boy. And God was with them. And he says, in what becomes the Arab nation, he was with him. And Abraham ends up staying in this area of Gerar. And Ishmael comes down into this area. So down in verse 22, chapter 21, verse 22, at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Can you hear the irritation in his voice? Now swear to me, here before God, that you will not deal falsely with me and my children, my descendants. He doesn't trust this Abraham guy. Of course, maybe he just saw him kick out his oldest son. Maybe something like that kind of says, what kind of a person is this that God will continue to work through this guy? Show to me and the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness I have sworn to you. Abraham said, I swear it. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. Now on that day, you aren't going to be living out in that desert. unless you have a well. You have to have access to water. And we actually have what they consider to be the Abraham's well. Here's a picture. Abraham's well at Beersheba. Just in case you want to see what it looked like. Now, Abraham is, well, we talked before about the Arab people groups. Remember, Abraham was father to Ishmael, and Ishmael has 12 sons, and they all become the Arab people groups. And those groups also revere Abraham as a patriarch. So we may pay attention to this well because we are on that side of Isaac, right? But the well, Abraham's well, is a disputed territory for the Arabs also. So that's some of these things we have preserved, not because they're Christian sites, but because they're Muhammad sites, because of Abraham, of the Arabs coming through Muslim sites, because of that line of Ishmael. That's some of the battles that we see going over in the Holy Land are because of that, because we both, those are the revered sites. And at different battles, the different countries will they'll do something like set up their weapons right around Abraham's well. So then the other ones who also revere Abraham's well won't shoot them on that well. That we see that a lot in Israel, where they're battling over the same sites because they do come from that line, from Abraham's line. Okay.
Now, this isn't the same well that God gave to Ishmael.
Is this the same role that they talked about in the
No, I mean, is this the well that's in dispute in these verses, is that the same one that God provided for Hagar and Ishmael?
We don't know that. It's probably not, because we hear nothing more of Ishmael with Abraham ever again. That's it. When it says down there that in verse 21, while he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. And that's the end.
There is one verse that talks about him coming for Abraham's
Abraham's what?
funeral. After he died, he came in to
Oh,
help.
well, I'll be glad
help
to see
him,
that.
bury his father.
That'll be interesting to see. I haven't seen that. That's good to know. I was under the information that he did not appear again. So as far as I know, this Abraham says he dug this well. And he tells Abimelech, I want you to recognize that we dug this well. And if you say, well, who matters who dug it? Well, it matters about who owns it. If you dug it, then you own it, and someone can't come take it from you. But apparently, Abraham dug it on Abimelech's land. So it seems like Abimelech could say he owns it. Go ahead.
You might be wrong. I know Isaac was Esau and Isaac. And one of them pretty bad. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I thought this was the last time. So we'll see. Okay, verse 25. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard it from you only today. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men had a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flocks, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves? He replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called Beersheba. Beersheba means well of 7 or well of the oath. So 7 could be translated as oath or as 7, as the number 7, which that does make sense because in our Jewish culture, 7 is a whole complete number. So it would make sense that those words would be very closely related. The word for oath and the word for 7 means complete, and oath meaning a promise or sure completeness. Verse 32, after the treaty had been at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there he called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. Okay, so we're going to see then the next section. We see Abraham has some turmoil, some testing, some come to Jesus moment, so to speak. So up until,
Is there any significance to Tamar's tree?
not that I know of, I don't know what the significance would be, except that that's what you did when you were in those regions. You would settle, you'd plant some shade for yourself, and you wouldn't have just a tree that could grow on its own. You'd have to give it water from that well you dug. And so, yeah, it was a very harsh land, a land not unlike ours here. So you would plan for your shade and your water in order to be able to stay there.
Yeah, that's what it says in my study notes, that they planted a tamarack tree, which is a tree with many branches and small leaves. It is lightly grown to a height of 20 to 30 feet. So that would be good.
We have tamarisk trees all around here, and they grow well in this kind of desert region. And they don't require very much water. And this land is very similar to the kind of land Abraham would have been living in. Very similar. Yeah. So what do you think the takeaway is on Abraham? Right now, he's pretty much a ninny.
Yeah,
But,
that's a lot of sisters, so-called.
well, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think that's the takeaway.
Believing the promise.
Believing the promise. He kept believing the promise. And he kept acting what God told him to do. When God told him to do it, he did it. When God said to this circumcision will be a sign of the covenant, he did it to his little guy, which must have been hard. That's not their tradition. It was something that was new for them. To send Ishmael away, that would have been very difficult for him to do. But he did it because God said, you need to send him away. Why? Maybe it was because Ishmael was mocking Isaac, and God didn't want Isaac growing up in that kind of environment. You know, maybe that was a good thing for Ishmael to be separated and go a different way.
Or would maybe have something to do with the eldest son's birthright, etc.
God had already told him what Ishmael's promises were. We read it back in the previous chapter, that Ishmael was going to be blessed and have many sons, and what would happen from his people. So we know that he had a blessing.
It really wouldn't be a healthy situation for either child.
No.
For the older child, you know that this one's always going to get all the attention because he's this promise. And the younger child is always going to have the older mocking and the comparison is.
And it just makes me think that's why God said, well, it's about time, let's get this separated. But God took care of Ishmael and provided for him and Hagar, and they did okay. You know, it's not like he just left it out. He took care of him.
And then Joseph and the brothers.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
They took care of that. They didn't have to live with them anymore.
that could have been the kind of thing Ishmael would be looking for, opportunities to trip up little Isaac, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting how things work out. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for giving us this lesson of Abraham. I pray that we might learn to obey you and to trust you and to be people of faith. We thank you for showing us that we don't have to be perfectly right all the time, that we just need to stay on your path and continue to be yielded to what you tell us. Help us to listen for your promptings, listen for what you have to tell us. When we get in a situation like Abraham, we can pray and you will guide us and direct us. And even though it might seem like an awful thing to send Hagar and Ishmael out into the desert with water and food, we know that if you say that's what needs to happen, that you're going to take care of it. We trust you for that. It's in Jesus' name that we pray.